Welcome to Town Hall Meeting number 8. Thank you so much for being here. We have some great speakers for you today. Our not new friends, because we've known them for a long time, but our beloved friends and experts. We have Dr. Bill Razska, Dr. Ben Lee, Dr. Breena Holmes, and Dr. Becca Bell here today to speak with us about all things new and to answer all the questions that you are getting inundated with by families and teachers and administrators and your neighbor and everyone around you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Razska, who's going to start with Omicron.
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you for this town hall. It's great to see some familiar faces. And again, I want to thank you so much for what you do. You have really been at the point of this. You have been wrestling with just difficult issues for a long time, just crushed with work. So we are so deeply appreciative of all that you do. As much as I'd like to be able to answer all the questions, I do not think we'll be able to do that. We'll give you some data that we have, some of the emerging data. We'll give you some opinion, but as you can imagine, this is a really fluid environment right now, and that things are changing very quickly. All of you know that, and it's been really hard to keep abreast. And whether we're counting in Martian days or Earth days, it too has been challenging. You know, even counting to 5 has been somewhat challenging. So we recognize the challenge you have. And I think we're just going to start with just a PowerPoint about some of the stuff that's emerged about Omicron has led to some of the decisions by the CDC. So, can you see a slide on Omicron? All right, excellent. So the first thing we're going to just discuss very briefly is just, this idea, is this virus more infectious? And that data really emerged in South Africa, very early on, when they were saying, hey, we're not seeing as many hospitalizations. We're not seeing as many people who are really sick. And there was some discounting of that because this was a somewhat younger population, and that may not have reflected the worldwide population. But I think the data that emerged in the UK, which had its own big surge, and our data would suggest that indeed this disease, this viral variant is not as severe. It doesn't cause a severe disease. Now, does it cause severe disease? Absolutely. You're an unimmunized 72-year-old person with diabetes and chronic obstructive lung disease. I would be really worried about getting Omicron. So I'm not saying this is not a disease to be concerned about, but certainly the data is pretty clear, I think, that it is causing less severe disease. And it's overwhelmingly clear that it's more infectious. I mean, that we don't have to show any data. We all know that. It just wiped out Delta in a week. That's, you have to be really infectious to do that. So remember, Delta was 50% more infectious than the wild type. This is at least 50% more infectious than Delta was. So the next topic is really, what's the incubation period? An incubation period is the time between you get infected with the organism and you develop symptoms. And we have some data to suggest that the incubation period for Omicron is actually shorter. And what I say is it's shorter for Delta and shorter for wild type. So wild type is, let's just call it pre-Delta. The data suggests that the median incubation period is approximately 3 days. And there are 2 sets of data to help drive that. One is actually a very small contact tracing in a household in Chicago, I believe, from someone who returned from Africa. And then a fairly large group in Norway, where there's a big congregation of people, and they had like 117 exposure, and 80 people got Omicron, and they had this great contact tracing. So an important concept here is that the median incubation period is 3 days. That means that half the people have an incubation period shorter than that. It means they'll have symptoms shorter than that, and half the people will have symptoms more than 3 days after onset of infection. And you can see 0 to 8. You say, well, how can it be 0? In Chicago, people got symptomatic, got transferred, they got sick really quickly. But so it's roughly 3 days. Why is that? Well, here's some interesting data, and it's a little bit blurry, but basically Omicron, this is Omicron at 24 hours and human nasal airway cells. So what you can see is that very, very quickly, 24 hours post-infection, in the purple bar, you can see there's a massive amount of Omicron. This is an in vitro study where they took cells and see how quickly they can be infectious. But it would appear that Omicron can affect the nasal epithelium cells very quickly and in high titer. That might be, this actually has a couple implications. It has something to do with the incubation period, but it also might have to do with something about the localization of the disease, more nasal, more upper respiratory tract than lung, and also a couple of things about their symptoms complex. And then, the other things, this is, Delta will catch up to it, but this is really interesting, how quickly it can affect these cells and in such high titer. And I think Ben and Breena and others will probably monitor the chat box while I'm talking. All right. Are the symptoms different? People have said, well, there's an overlap, there's not an overlap, whatever. This is just to say there's a tremendous overlap between Omicron and Delta. And you would be hard pressed to say, based on a symptom complex, that someone has this variant versus another. But the suggestion is that there's just more sore throat. I mean, sore throat was not a super common complaint with Delta and the wild type. It is a much more common in Omicron. Runny nose, congestion. This is really a hallmark of Omicron these days, particularly in children. There's less, this is, again, the data suggests increased sore throat, runny nose, and congestion, and the data suggests less cough and there's less loss of taste or smell. So remember, 20% of adults had loss of taste or smell. It was less common in children, but this is a fairly unusual finding in Omicron. So as much as I like that movie about the woman sniffing the pen there, that may not be the best test for Omicron. But again, there seems to be more replication in the upper respiratory tract rather than lower respiratory, and that's why we're not seeing as much severe disease and we're not seeing as much cough. Rapid antigen testing. How many of you have heard controversies about rapid antigen testing and loss of sensitivity and whether you should be doing it from the oral pharynx? It's like suddenly that's exploded. Just really intense. So what's going on? There is some suggestion that rapid antigen testing that we use, and again, you can't even see who this is. I try to do it just black and white. So I have no idea who makes this kit. I have no relationship to anyone. Maybe less sensitive than for other variants. I would say there's no peer-reviewed data on that. And the FDA sort of muddied the waters, I think about 7 or 8 days ago, when they said it might be less sensitive, but they didn't explain why. And it was basically someone had done a study on 20 people and said, look, we found that when we compared PCR to rapid antigen test, the PCR was positive on day 1 and the rapid antigen test didn't come back positive till day 3. That was a tiny group of 20 people, not peer reviewed. And then some of this is based upon laboratory data where they're saying it doesn't seem to bind quite as well. So there is a suggestion that it's less sensitive, but we have no earthly idea how much. The data is imprecise. It's not finite. It's just a suggestion right now. There's also a suggestion that's not as sensitive for the anterior nares, and that you've heard a lot of things about people testing the oral pharynx and then doing the nose or something else like that. There's this idea that the virus is replicating the oral pharynx more rapidly, and that's a little bit based upon people doing saliva tests and find it in saliva before they found it in the nose. Again, unpeer reviewed, a lot of ex vivo data, laboratory data, only a couple things, but it led to a lot of people actually doing these rapid antigen tests. They're swabbing the back of the throat and then swabbing the nose. The FDA actually stepped in and said, you should only use the rapid antigen test as authorized. It is what we have. We should use it as authorized. There's a possibility, we're not sure, it could be a little bit sensitive. It could be the anterior nares, but I would not recommend using the rapid antigen test anywhere else other than where it's authorized. If you can use the saliva test, you can, but I don't think children are very easily going to be able to generate 5 milliliters of saliva for the saliva tests. It's a pretty hard thing to do. So that's been out there. Duration of infectivity. In theory, all biologic processes have a normal distribution curve. That means there's a mean and there's stuff to the left and stuff to the right, and there's this fairly uniform pattern. You can have a left or right skew, but it's a biologic construct. And we make decisions. We make decisions all the time about, where we're going to make a cutoff for something. So if I do my annotation, we can say testing in school, we're going to set, okay, at this level, everyone gets an A. We arbitrarily say anyone this level gets an A. Or we can say, we'll accept a risk of infectivity of 1.7% or something else like that. But you can use this distribution curve for lots of different things as thresholds for cutoffs, for any sort of thing, for positively or negatively, just to make sure we understand what this distribution curve is all about. I put that up there because I'm going to put this in a screen mode if I can. So if we look at this curve, this is a curve for, let's say, viral shedding in a person who has Omicron. So this is when they're symptomatic, peak symptoms right here, right there. And we can see that, we're going to just say that you can shed before you're symptomatic. I'm pretty comfortable with that. You can shed and that's common in a zillion viral infections. Early in the pandemic, and don't ignore these numbers here. I just had to I couldn't draw the curve very well. Just ignore these numbers down here. Early in the pandemic, we said people can get out of isolation at 10 days because we felt fairly comfortable that the risk that these people were infectious at 10 days was roughly a little bit less than 10%. We made a decision that we would accept possibly up to a 10% transmission infectivity at that time. And that was fine. Things have moved, but now you've shifted the incubation period to the left. You've shifted it to a little bit to the left. Remember, in original COVID, the initial time to peak was like this, okay? So it has shifted there. And what I wanted to show this fancy animation, but it clearly has not worked. So I'll just stop it. Clear and end it. So we have now decided, the CDC, that you can stop isolation at 5 days. Remember, you have to be isolated for 5 days, and after 5 days, you clear. And they have accepted that there is a greater risk. They have accepted that there may be a greater risk for infectivity there. Greater than 10%. Even on the CD, if you look at the website, they'd say up to 30%. That's based upon a model behind you. That's a model. They're not saying that 30% of people are infectious at day 5 or they're not saying that 30% of people are infectious day 6. As a model, they can say up to 30% can. And the reason why they feel comfortable with that, they're going to say, look, peak infectivity is right here. The peak infectivity is just before you're sick, while you're sick, and then it comes down very quickly. And they're just saying, we're going to release people from isolation when their peak infectivity is really waning. And that was the basis of their decision. And you can argue, well, that seems a big risk here, but there are a lot of reasons for that. And there are a lot of economic reasons and social reasons for that. Finally, I need to clear my annotations here and just say, what's the vaccine efficacy of Omicron? We've heard a lot about this. This curve is a little confusing, but I put it because I put it up there because of the confidence intervals. And what we're saying is that, the protection against infection, that's a really key word, infection, not disease, infection, okay, was not so good against Omicron in fully vaccinated people. And it may be as low as 30%, but let's say it's roughly here, all right? But the idea was that if you got your booster here, you restored the activity of the vaccine. All right, so there were much less risk of becoming infected. So you went from 30% risk of 30% protection to 70% protection. So that is the rationale for recommending boosters for lots and lots of people, and the recommendation for boosters even in children as young as 12 now. The idea that protection wanes fairly quickly against Omicron. You're only 30% protected against infection, but with booster, you get up to 70% protection. All right. So I think that is my last data slide. Other than that, this is just, why we like it. And it's a little tricky. I would say it's a little confusing right now what it means to be fully vaccinated. Are you ready? Fully vaccinated means that you have completed the primary series. You are up to date with your vaccinations if you've completed the primary series and had your booster. This is for adults. So I'm going to write that now. For 18 years old, okay? This is what the CDC is saying. CDC, all right? That I'm very careful about my words here. Am I precise enough, Becca and Breena? I'm precise enough? The CDC is saying, okay, fully vaccinated, if you have your series, your primary series, that means you're fully vaccinated, but you're not up to date unless you've gotten your primary series, this is for mRNA, plus your booster. And that has very important implications because you can imagine if you're doing international travel and you change what what your vaccine series is, it chaos for passports, for travel, and everything else. What the CDC is saying is that get your primary series and get your booster. All right.
Thanks, Bill.
Susanna, officially 14 days after your booster, you are now up to date. That's what the CDC is saying.
So there's a question about, is fully vaccinated the same for children and teens as it is for adults?
It is the same. So and what's a little challenging is that there's a distinction between fully vaccinated and up to date with regard to quarantine if you're exposed to somebody.
Yeah.
That's where the challenge comes.
And Kaitlyn put that, Kaitlyn Kodzis put that nicely in the chat too. I was going to talk, so I'm Becca Bell. I work in the pediatric ICU at UVM Children's Hospital, and I'm currently the president of the Vermont chapter, the AAP. Also because I always think it's relevant and grounding. I also have one fully vaccinated kid now, a 6-year-old in school, and then a 4-year-old who's in full-time childcare who's too young to be vaccinated. And I echo everything Bill said about you all really holding everything together this entire pandemic, and just wanted to give a little bit of an overview about where we might be headed over the next few weeks and few months. I will say that the 4 of us who are on, we're all pediatricians. None of us work for the state. And so there may be some specifics that we can bring back to folks, but we often consult or give our opinion. And so we want to just let you all know where we feel comfortable going. And a lot of that is really generally, you've heard about just kind of moving towards an endemic situation and what that would look like and what that would look like in the schools. So I do want to just start with a little bit of perspective around. So I work in the ICU, and March of 2020 was a really, really scary time, as it was for everyone. I mean, we had to just shut everything down, as you all recall, because there was a completely novel virus that we had no community immunity to anywhere. And people were getting really sick and people were dying. Nobody had vaccine-induced immunity. Nobody had infection-induced immunity. It was a very scary time. We were like scrambling to make sure we had enough ventilators. Really terrible. And we were most concerned, as a pediatrician, I was initially like, kids have got to get really sick from this. I mean, they get like one, little bit of RSV in their nose and they are like in the hospital so sick. So they're going to have to get sick from this. But the early data was really showing us that kids really weren't getting as sick as, as other respiratory viruses. And that has really borne out to be true throughout this. And I'm happy at some point if people want to talk more about pediatric illness and in COVID. But, and then we didn't know when vaccines were going to be available and how effective they would be. And initially, it was pretty shocking, at least to me, that the vaccines initially really looked like Dr. Razska talked a bit about infection versus disease. It was great and continued to be great against severe disease. But also at the beginning, it almost looked like people who were vaccinated couldn't even get infected, right? We were all surprised by that. And, it wasn't something that I expected at all. And so I think we kind of got into this time period where we thought, okay, well, like, you're vaccinated, you can't get infected, like, let's move on. There were just many parents, even adolescents, when they were able to get vaccinated, who thought, like, I think this virus is just going to go away. Like, I don't even think I need to get my kid vaccinated. But it's definitely not going away, and it will be with us in various forms. And the key really was to get as many people vaccinated as we could and protected against disease, right? And we're probably not going to be able to do it's not going to be perfect against infection, but against disease. So I think this fall with Delta has been a really, really challenging time because we have this more transmissible virus, and it's been impossible to get a handle on in terms of what you all are doing, which is the contact tracing and excluding, having kids stay home or do test to stay, which is also a ton of work. And early in the pandemic, when Dr. Razska was sort of showing that bell curve, right, we got to make a cutoff. We were so strict about, like, there's an exposure anywhere, say there's an exposure at school, we are going to have all these people stay home, even though maybe none of them will ever be infected. But we're at a point right now where we just are going to prevent every single case in the school, every single chance of transmission. And over time, we really felt like we need to actually look more critically at that, because are we really going to, exclude people from school and do all of that work that you all are doing to make that happen, which also creates a lot of tension between families and you, which is a huge challenge. And so anyway, we did test to stay in some places, so that understanding there's like a little bit of risk involved, but that it was definitely worth it. And so very slowly sort of realizing that what kind of work do we need to put in to get the impact that we want. And I'm just going to share the story with you that I read about yesterday, because I think all of you who are just living in the guidelines and protocols will appreciate the story, and it helps sort of to put things in perspective. But this is an Omicron story. So I was reading yesterday in the paper that there's an outbreak at a research lab in Antarctica, and I was super interested. How did this happen? And so I found the protocol that they used to bring the scientists and workers there. So thinking about this from our school guideline protocols, they had scientists take have to have a negative PCR test at their country of origin. They flew to South Africa. They quarantined then in South Africa for 10 days. At day 5, they took another PCR test. If that was negative, they finish out the 10 days. They take another PCR test. They get on a special plane. They go to Antarctica. They quarantine again for 5 more days, take another test. There's Omicron there. So then somebody had some symptoms, got tested shortly after, was positive. They immediately tested everyone. There were already 2 people positive. They flew those 3 people out, and they tested everyone again. And there were 14 more people who were positive the next day. So I think just reflecting on that story, and I think in what's happening in the school setting is that we have these high expectations and high standards for what we're doing in the school in terms of contact tracing. That's not happening anywhere else. And so, thinking about that Antarctica story, do we think, okay, whose fault is that? Is that somebody who didn't do the right protocol? Should it have been 7 days or 10 days instead of 5 days? What kind of testing did they do? Should they have done multiple rapid antigen tests? Was somebody lying? Was somebody not quarantining? I mean, it's Antarctica, so I think they're quarantining. So this is the most controlled setting you could ever imagine, with people super invested. Nobody was lying. People were following the rules, and there was Omicron in Antarctica. So I think that like that story just really almost like was kind of in a way like a relief. Just like, it's just like hard. This is hard. And the reason why it's a relief is that the second part of the story is that people were vaccinated and everyone's fine. They have mild illness. They gave the option for people to, if they wanted to leave, they could leave. Everyone's like, I'm doing okay. I'm going to stay. I feel fine. And they're continuing to work. So kind of keeping that story in mind, what we really want to do is think about how do we get to the point where school nurses are doing the thing that you are all trained to do, and the thing that as pediatricians, we rely on you doing for kids in the community. And when your leadership here presented to Dan French last month, your survey results about vision screening and mental and hearing screening and dealing with mental health stuff and dealing with IEP stuff. And basically you all are saying, I can't do that because I'm contact tracing 10 hours a day. That, to me as a pediatrician, made me sad and made me worried. And also it just is not the right use of your skills and time. And that was sort of during Delta. And it felt like, again, Delta was a slow crush, like it wasn't sustainable, but nothing, our hands weren't sort of being forced. And now with Omicron, Dr. Razska showed that short incubation period. I mean, even trying to contact trace anywhere is really, really hard. It's hard to make an impact. And so thinking back to sort of reevaluating what we're doing in schools and really thinking about how we can just best manage this and think about symptoms, think about, how we can sort of shift some of this responsibility and work to the homes. And again, try to get back to repairing relationships with families. I mean, there's been a ton of stress I hear from school nurses with colleagues, with families, with students. And over, I just keep hearing people saying, I feel like the COVID police. I feel like the COVID police. I'm like, just all I'm doing is like enforcing stuff. And I'm telling people to do stuff that they don't want to do. And it's really, really hard. So that's just an overview of I think where we're trying to get to a point where people are we're monitoring symptoms, where people are able to have better adequate testing that doesn't necessarily have to go through you, and that we start to trust people more, trust all of each other more, a little bit more. And so that you are no longer put in the middle of this really tricky situation. So that's just kind of my overview. And I know there's like a million questions, I'll hand it over now to Ben next to chat.
Thanks, Becca. I've been furiously trying to do the best I can to keep up with all the questions in the chat. So I'll confess I didn't get to hear every part of what you just went over. I guess what I would like to just say, and again, apologies if you've already said some of the same stuff. One of the first of all. I just want to echo, thanks for inviting us, allowing us to be here and to talk through these things with you. The work that this group has been doing on behalf of our kids, my kids, and all of our kids has just been phenomenal. And if you guys don't hear it enough, I just want to tell you, at least for me personally, I'm just astounded at the job that you guys have been doing and the effort that you guys have been putting in. I'm actually getting a little bit emotional. Sorry. Because you're doing work, you're doing sort of a task that, to be perfectly blunt, most of the rest of the society has sort of given up on. I don't know what other way to put it, and that's trying to keep people safe. I think for me, when I look at what Omicron means for not just schools, but just COVID in America and the world, is it is becoming very, very obvious that we've reached sort of a tipping point or an inflection point where it's obvious that the things that we were trying to do previously, certainly last school year, even to some extent during Delta, really some of those things just aren't going to continue to be useful or have the same degree of success with Omicron. And what that means is we're in the process of trying to make this transition from approaching this virus in pandemic mode to learning how to transition to a mode where we live with the virus as an endemic virus. So what that means is we're seeing the transition of this virus from a pandemic pathogen to something like influenza and RSV and parainfluenza, the virus that classically causes croup in young kids. And it's navigating that transition towards full-on pandemic response to, okay, how do we incorporate this sort of into our daily living in a way that feels reasonable and safe and practical. And what I think that means is that it's going to be a bumpy transition. There's lots and lots of questions and lots of uncertainty. But that's sort of the task at hand for all of us, not just in the school setting, but for all of us. And I think that a lot of the updated guidance that's been coming out from the CDC, for example, recently is trying to sort of get to that to a certain extent. I think that I agree the added benefit of contact tracing in the setting of Omicron. We don't get the same bang for the buck anymore, especially when we have so many cases. And so I definitely hear you all when you say that this just does not seem sustainable. And so I think the goal though is try to figure out how to transition away from full pandemic mode to how to incorporate this sort of into the background risk of attending school and being out in society, et cetera. And I'd be happy to share more specific thoughts on that, but if asked, but that's really sort of what the big picture message that I want to send. And I get it. It will be a challenge. It's going to be a bumpy transition. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty. In full disclosure, I've been struggling myself all week, just trying to keep up with like, wait, now the CDC has said this, like now Vermont, said this. And so we're all there with you, and we're all, trying to do the best we can to keep up with the guidance and, get accurate information out to everybody. But I'll be the first to say it has not been a smooth process this week. But all I can say is I think, thank you again for everything that you all are doing, and we'll try to keep doing the best that we can.
So Dr. Holmes, would you like to go next? And thank you, Dr. Lee, appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben, Clayton. Hi, everyone. I have a lot of emotion tonight too. That was really moving to see Ben react to just being with you all, and Thursday afternoon, Thursday night, after like arguably one of the worst weeks for school nurses and pediatricians since this whole thing began. So I feel that, and I think some of us, we wanted to be with you tonight, even though we don't have all the answers yet. There's still a few policy decisions on the table in Vermont that have made the chat interesting, because you're getting officially wonderful Kaitlyn Kodzis is just laying out what we know today, and then you're getting a little appropriate editorializing with Ben and Bill and Becca. So, and that's kind of the Vermont way. So just want to really add my gratitude to all of you, and to sit with you in what just happened since Sunday. I think we were all kind of thrown into it whirlwind, somewhat unexpectedly by the timing of CDC changes, and then also the the backfilling of what that means for children. So just another Breena editorial that I don't think that policy was entirely informed by children and their importance of children. So it's important that we stick together as a group of people that that's our primary goal. So my job tonight, a couple things. I will just make the most clear thing I need to say, because I don't work for state government anymore. Remember, you guys all know me in many roles, but I just want to help be that liaison. So the original guidance, December 29th, said that people who were close contacts that were not boosted had to quarantine, which was a big setback. And then on the 4th of January, the CDC said, no, not the 5 to 17-year-olds. They don't have to quarantine if they're not boosted. But unfortunately, we're waiting for Vermont to adopt the CDC. So I know you're all in a big swirl about that. And I know that many schools are not quarantining those kids. I know many schools are. And we just, every day, we're just pushing and pushing for the policy people to get that thing over the finish line, because there's no reason to quarantine 5 to 17-year-olds who haven't been boosted, because so few of them were even eligible until yesterday. And then it's just also the CDC policy now, and we want to adopt it. So, we hoped we were going to be able to tell you that today. We can't, because it's 5 o'clock and it's not official. But so that I wanted to call out, because it's big and onerous. The other job I have is to talk about the pediatric algorithm. So the pediatric algorithm has outlived its utility. It's down to the smallest font in the graphic design world. It has been inaccurate for about a month or two now in some of its guidance, as we've shifted in our deeper understanding of how vaccinated people should behave. And there's no way it can accommodate these new changes in isolation, quarantining. And the symptomatology piece, and that using it as a way to sort of figure out how long have you had a symptom, when do you get a test, and how do you get back to school, also isn't really that accurate in this Omicron thing. Because remember, we even had a section in the algorithm that said if your symptoms resolve in 24 hours, you're good to go. That's not infectious disease true anymore with Omicron. So we're not leaving you high and dry. What's going on right now, real time, with the MCH team at the health department and the pediatric leaders is we want to get all the department resource to you: isolation, quarantine, the testing grid, understanding household contacts and what the implication is for exposure. Day zero, what is day zero? How do you count? What is day 5? I mean, it is all to slow down and to fix documents and to have clarity. And the most important thing we want to work on in the next few days is the symptomatic decision-making that goes on between pediatricians and parents and school nurses and families. So rather than try to make an algorithm that addresses all of that, because that thing was lofty. I mean, I know it really had utility and you used it beautifully, but it tried to address too much. It was either you were exposed, you weren't, you were close contact, you weren't, or maybe you were even, parsing symptoms at one point. So now we just really want to think about, you're a school nurse, a pediatric office, a triage nurse in the office, and you have a kid who has a headache, a kid who has a runny nose one day. How do we test that kid? How do we get clarity on who has COVID, who doesn't? But the thing we want to say, and I saw that Dory put out a really cool thing at the beginning, like what are the most important things we can be doing as a community together between school nurses and pediatric? I think Bill Razska said, let's talk about that at the end, but staying home when you're sick and how you handle yourself when you're sick, in parentheses, get a test, is the present and the future. So we really want to work with you on that. And I know this week's availability of tests has been dismal. That's not the future. Antigen tests are flying into the state, and the federal government's figuring it out, and the state governments are figuring it out, and you are going to have way more antigen tests than you did Monday. And then PCR tests are, according to the health commissioner, they're expanding and contracting, and we're going to keep being responsive about that. So I know we got in a really bad place over like the holiday weekend, long waits for PCR, still inadequate antigen supply. So the pediatric algorithm is gone. We sunset it like essentially today. And many of you have fed back to me that you were still using pieces of it, but I promise you that the team is going to give you all the materials you need. But as we're in this 4 or 5 days of getting it right, feedback is welcome. We're super interested in how you've been using it, even though it's been a little inaccurate with even like what day to test and all that. So I hope that's not some big bomb. But we're very interested in your feedback about that. The second thing I've been given the task to discuss, it's in the chat as well, is return to play. Return to play is not a public policy. It's not part of the state health department. It wasn't decided by the governor. Okay. Return to play is medical guidance about the very, 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 very small risk that somebody that's had COVID would have a significant cardiac event associated with that infection. So unfortunately today I have to, confirm for you that the protocol hasn't changed. So all of the change in isolation and quarantine, and you can go back to Society Day 5+. I like to call it Day 6, but I have no authority to do that. That has nothing to do with return to play, which is heartbreaking, exhausting. It's breaking the backs of pediatricians. It's terrible for kids. But we're in a process now. We can't turn against national guidance about cardiac disease. So Becca Bell has written to the National AAP and said, can we rethink this with data and analysis? We need the American Heart Association, the cardiologists. We need everybody to urgently analyze the fact we are asking kids to not even be cleared after COVID until they've been 10 days. And then their clearance begins. So I can barely talk. This is the thing that's going to bring me to emotion this week. I can barely talk about this because I know what this means for children, and I know you've been in the middle of it, even though we've worked so hard to have you not be in the middle of it. We really wanted this to be something that patients and families talk to their pediatrician about, but I know a lot of you got in the way. And not in the way, you got involved because you're amazing and you felt that you needed to be some sort of bridge for this. So I'm open to the feedback. We've been receiving it all week and we know it's backbreaking. And I think I'll stop there as those were my 2 pieces and I'll see if anything came up in the chat. Raina, you were not supposed to be the middle people. And I'm so glad to hear maybe you never were. It's stuff that many of you have written to us this week and said that you're trying to broker it because we've got athletic trainers in some schools, not all. We have elementary school kids who are sitting out recess, which is stigmatizing. Because if they're sitting out recess, that means people know they had COVID. Why would they be sitting on a sideline of a Frisbee game, or I don't know what you play indoors, badminton? So you've got a lot of advocates in your pediatric colleagues and community saying this is outrageous. The other piece, it's too much. The original protocol said the pediatrician should see the kid to clear her. And that's that there's no room in the office in a busy January pediatric practice to see 13 kids this week who all are coming COVID. So great colleagues, Timberlane Pediatrics, Leah Costello has put out protocol for pediatric offices to use on how to use your triage nurses and have clearance over the phone by just asking some questions of the patient with COVID. That's free to be used by all, and Clayton can distribute it. We shared it with the VCHIP call yesterday. That takes care of the working through some of the burdens on the pediatric office, but it doesn't change this onerous timeline that we cannot get kids back to what they love most, which is, for some kids, physical activity and their athletic pursuits. Okay. I have not been able to keep up with the chat. I'm here to hear all your thoughts and feedback on that, and wish we had better news.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes. And I'd like to say that if the governor ever watches this and he hears the crackling, he'll know that we need to work on broadband and mobile cellular service There was a little crackling there, but I'm so glad that you can actually have picture and voice at the same time. So that was really awesome. I don't know if we have any other specific canned presentations or spokespeople right now. I was going to do a couple of the questions out of, so a lot of folks submitted questions early for at COVID-19 at VSSNA.org. We took all of those questions and we put them into a shared document. And Kaitlyn, Dr. Lee, Dr. Razska, Dr. Holmes, and Dr. Bell have all been reviewing that. I also shared that document with Julia Pringle from the EPI team. So there are some questions for, there was some contact tracing and some other questions I thought maybe she could respond to also. We're going to collect all of this answers, try to consolidate some of the questions that are similar and get that out as soon as we can. So I'm not going to go through some of the ones that have already been responded to. I'm not going to read those right now because you can get that in writing, hopefully by end of Friday. So the first one I see here is previous guidance, and anybody that can weigh in on this, this is to the group. Previous guidance suggested the quarantine requirements for exposure in the home was different than normal close contact exposure. Is that true with the new guidance, or does everyone fall under the 5-day rule?
I'll take that. I think that in terms of just simple contact, it's not different. It was just at the home, we had to figure out when the last exposure occurred. And that was what was different about it. So if you had parents, you had to figure out, who was infected, who would potentially be next infected, when was the last exposure. That was the tricky part about that, because there could potentially be continued exposure in the home. If you knew when exactly that ended, it's the same.
Thank you. The next one I have here that doesn't have a response was, can the school stop doing a line list? This is unnecessary work since the school has already notified and instructed close contacts. It is merely collecting data for the state, as contact tracers are not following up with anyone on our list. That's a statement. I don't know if that's a question. I don't know if anybody on here can answer that.
Clayton, I was told by the contact tracing team on Tuesday that effective this week, we are done turning in line lists. I can get more confirmation on that for our website.
Yeah, I think that would be great. If we could get who made that statement and its official statement, that'd be fabulous, because I saw a lot of people doing a double cheer, right? So that would be fabulous. Thank you. So the next one, this is a little lengthy, so bear with me for a second. The CDC currently recommends a 14-day quarantine for unvaccinated children who are exposed to COVID with some options mentioned for 10 and 7-day quarantine. What is the rationale for Vermont's use of 5-day quarantine with no requirements for testing at the end of 5 days? This seems imprudent, as our schools are having great difficulty handling the COVID cases and the rates keep increasing. And if it would be better, I can put that into the chat. Would that be easier so you can read it again? So, okay, I'll do that.
That sounds like, though, so that has changed, right? So we're talking about who's quarantining after an exposure if you're unvaccinated. The CDC changed it. This is the whole, right? CDC changed it, and then the state adopted it. And the CDC said, the reasoning per Dr. Razska's graph, and what the CDC said is that you're most infectious the 2 days before, the 3 days after. And really, again, a lot of management now is to think about, how do we keep people home during their most infectious period in a way that, we target that time. So that has changed nationally, and for the state, it's that 5 days. Again, the key thing is, after day 5 is, again, you're asymptomatic, right? So, or symptoms significantly improving. So that piece I don't want to get lost. Back to Dr. Holmes's point is like really thinking about sick, symptomatic people, and those folks are staying home. The state added on this recommendation to test with an antigen test. And then the CDC also made some recommendations around that, but it's not required anywhere to test out of it. And part of that, I have to say, is, I would say we agree with not requiring that, because again, when you require something, somebody has to enforce it, who's that going to be? Right. Like, we don't want that to be you. So, hence a recommendation not required. And I don't know that any place, any other state is requiring it.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question. And since that's in there now, if anybody wants to respond in writing to that too, please feel free.
Can I make one comment?
Yes,
Clayton,
please.
I think
Yes,
I
please.
fixed my sound.
That's perfect.
So I know you guys have been tangled like I have for 21 months about, do you go to the CDC website or do you go to the health department website? There are enough differences between these two policies right now that you're going to have to stick with Vermont Department of Health for the guidance about these little nuances as it relates to isolation, quarantine, test recommendations. And I think that got really confusing over break. And I know we had a particular school nurse communication blast about what was going on the CDC website, and they released an hour ago, maybe 2 hours ago, more documents on how to handle all of this in schools, but none of it has been adopted by the Vermont Department of Health, and none of it is our policy. So it's been that way all along, but it used to be that our policy kind of got out ahead of CDC and, I think was better. And now CDC sort of busting along, putting stuff out, and we're kind of behind. I don't know. There's something funny about this in our, so you have to go to the health department website and hope it gets as up to date as possible in the next few days.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to read this question, but I'm also putting it into the chat at the same time, I think. So unvaccinated children who are living with the COVID positive family member, according to the VCHIP algorithm, they should follow the 14-day quarantine testing. I think I was thinking the algorithm, if we're not using it anymore, I don't know if this is still valid question or a question that needs to be responded to. A 14-day quarantine with testing at 7 days if desiring an early return to school. How can the VDH justify decreasing this quarantine period and eliminating the testing requirement when there is prolonged contact within the home?
Again, and this gets back to if the last exposure at the home, if the last exposure took place on January 1st, and there's no other exposure, there's no one else infectious there, then the child can begin the quarantine period. We have allowed for either quarantine for 14 days or 5 to 7 days plus a test. That hasn't changed. And it's all about figuring out when the last exposure was, because a child does not enter its official quarantine period until the last exposure has taken place.
Okay, thank you. And this is I'm actually posting the question, and I'll read this. Parents are now sending kids to school with multiple COVID symptoms and telling us they did multiple home antigen tests with negative results. Can we require a PCR test in these cases, since we never have documentation of the results of the home tests or knowledge that the test was done properly and the person we are told it was done on? And if I could just add one piece to that. So in the Agency of Education's test to stay, the response testing that we do, as well as the diagnostic testing that we do, if we get if somebody has symptoms and they're at school and we do a antigen test and it comes back negative, then we also do a PCR test and we send that off to get that read, and they can't come back to school until we get the result of that. So I'm just, that's the Agency of Education's guidance for us, but that's only for in school. So if they're at home with the antigen test, I think is the difference between these two.
So I'll take that again if you want, Breena, just because we've been discussing, that's been a hot topic since I can't even keep track of the days. I think it was yesterday, but there are two components. One is that, and a big issue is that we're going to do strength-based in Vermont. We've always tried to be strength-based in Vermont, and that has been the philosophy of Vermont. And it's kind of interesting that there was this article that came across my desk, and it was from the Christian Science Monitor of all people, but it said, which state got this right? And at this point in time, we had a 12% infectivity rate. There's only one state in the nation that got this right, and it's Vermont. And that's because we've been civil, and that we have not had these terrible confrontations at different places, that there's been a civil discussion about this. So I really like this idea that there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of discussion, people are concerned, but we're treating each other with respect, and I still think we're going to go with strength-based. So I know it's sometimes anxious provoking when you see a child and you have to accept on faith that the parents did the antigen tests, but that is going to be our approach. 2, we've always required this PCR test for a person who's symptomatic and a person who has a negative antigen test. I do think that will change. I just have to, so my recommendation and our recommendation of this team has been that we can replace that with 2 consecutive antigen tests. Remember, we're not entirely comfortable with a single negative rapid antigen test in a person who's symptomatic. But if we have 2 consecutive negative rapid antigen tests and a symptomatic person separated by 24 hours, you're going to get some pretty good sensitivity there. So I think that is where we're going to move. Is that safe to say, Breena?
Well, I'm going to take us up one notch by saying that that scenario described that if that kid has symptoms, they're not supposed to come to school. So like, this is where your jobs are so hard, and they were hard before COVID, and then they got really bad during COVID, but we can't backpedal on that. Sick kids don't go to school, and antigen tests are not. So yes, Bill is kind of giving you a leading edge. You know, one of the things we like about being with you is we're seeing where you are. Your questions inform where all the glitches remain, and we've been getting them all week. And one of the big glitches is access to PCR tests, and the idea that we were very clear about school is that if kids had symptoms when we were trying to figure out if they had COVID in a context of returning to school, that's PCR, 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 and you're all knowing it and you're all reciting it in the chat. But that day is starting to shift, but not today. So it's Thursday. We're not accepting 2 antigen tests 24 hours apart tonight, but Bill is, as he should be, as our pediatric infectious disease specialist, telling you that feels good to him. That's a safe policy. And we have asked the powers that be to consider that shift, especially because antigen tests it's everything now. And as the supply increases and it's just the standard of care, we're just all going to have 10 kits in our house, and all our students are going to have them. And we're just going to be rapid antigening ourselves as our standard. We're not there yet, but we're okay with you guys. But for whatever that scenario was, and I lost in the chat because it was way high up, that's not currently acceptable today. But it might be tomorrow, Monday, Tuesday. And also, but sick kids need to stay home, and the pressure that you're getting from parents to waive that seems very antithetical to where we find ourselves on January 6th. Like, we've got, 6 weeks here, 4 weeks. We're in the crucible to get us past this Omicron thing and into our endemic state, which is why we're trying that today's talks are a little bit like that. We're trying to take you a couple of weeks hence in our brains about where we are. At the same time, we know you're in knee deep in all of it right now too.
Dr. Holmes, do you see the question that Ashley just asked? If you could maybe respond to that one, it might be helpful.
Sure.
It follows right along with what you're saying.
Are you saying, regards to test results, symptomatic kids should still be out of school? It seems kind of counterproductive. We're going to let a kid who tested positive with COVID return day 6 if symptoms improved. Well, I don't want to get into the semantics of the word improved. We certainly aren't letting kids with Omicron back if they're just mildly improved. You have to be just about well. I mean, the symptom improved is a massively subjective term that I imagine is really coming across your desk. So I hear you. I wouldn't want to put those 2 groups against each other. To be perfectly honest, I feel better about a day 6, the person that they did a test, we know what caused their virus, and they're well on their way to improvement and not infectious, versus a newly symptomatic person with no diagnosis. So I don't want to mix those 2. I don't want to go back to a world where we have symptomatic children in school and we don't know what they have. I hope that helps.
Thank you. So I'm going to post the next question in the chat and then read it. The 2 rapid tests needed seems to have changed again to recommended, not required. It was recommended, then went to required, and seems to be recommended again today. I had a student test positive at the Department of Health called the mom and said, and didn't even mention testing, just that he could return on day 5. Are we supposed to strongly encourage testing and providing families with the rapid test kits? Should we have stock of the OTC ones? And Kaitlyn might have responded to this earlier in the chat. I don't know. I saw that she was responding to that. I don't know if Kaitlyn could maybe talk to this one, if that's okay.
Sorry, I have to read it again. Hold on.
Okay.
Yeah, so currently testing is strongly recommended, but not required at the moment. So there is a strong recommendation for individuals to test, but it is not required.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, I'm going to read this and I'll post it. Is the expectation for students with special needs who test positive and cannot reliably mask to be out of school for the full 10 days?
So I guess the CDC guidelines say if they cannot mask, if they literally cannot mask, then they're out for 10 days. We get into some nuances about, can they unmask briefly at lunch? Can they unmask briefly at certain other situations? And we have accepted that. But if students really cannot mask for whatever reason, then they need to remain out of the school environment or any other environment for 10 full days.
Okay, thanks. So that was all of the questions that did not have a response already in our documents. Here's one. Is one vaccine on the J&J still considered fully vaccinated?
Technically, yes.
But is there a caveat to that, like with the 6 months past, that makes them so that they would still have to quarantine?
Yes. So once you've exceeded a certain time from the J&J vaccine and you're exposed to COVID, you would have to quarantine. Whereas if you had a J&J vaccine and got boosted, then you would not have to quarantine.
Thank you. And so Kaitlyn, the Vermont State School Nurse Consultant, would like to make some remarks. So I'm going to turn it over to Kaitlyn.
Yeah, thanks, Clayton. Once again, hi all. I just want to thank you so much for all that you have been doing, especially in the last, it feels like 10 years, but I think it's only been, 3 months since school started. This is a very stressful and messy time. I just want to let you all know that there will be a FAQ that will address a lot, hoping almost all of the questions that you have posted in the chat. This will be released as soon as we have finalized recommendations on quarantine and isolation from leadership. And the information given in the chat tonight is based on the current recommendations as of today, right now at 5:38 p.m. And since COVID is so fluent, know that the current guidance may change. And I really appreciate all your flexibility during this time as well. So once again, thank you all so much for what you're doing. I hope you can all enjoy like beautiful hot chocolate or meal or something tonight or this weekend, just to give yourself a little self-love and self-care. So thank you.
Great. So one thing I don't think we touched on and Kaitlyn, I really appreciate that. And you stepped into a position right in the middle of something that has made your job probably triply as hard. But thank you for all that you're doing and Ilisa is doing too, to make sure we're supported. So just truly, we all really appreciate that. And your furious typing in the chat box is really a testament to what you're trying to do to help us all.
Thanks, Clayton. Yeah, it's going to be exactly a year on Monday that I stepped into this role. So definitely a strange time.
Yeah. And the other question that's been asked is about test to stay, and at what point and I don't know exactly how to phrase the question, but test to stay with the new guidelines, with all of the students that are now past 6 months, the ones that specifically that weren't eligible, it makes that very, very large. And so trying to do test to stay every day, the amount of antigen tests that are going to be required, whether they're even available. And then the other thing is that if they're not available, then we don't really have test to stay, but parents are expecting it. It has been the new thing to get their children back to school. And we're really in a bind right now because the consumption of tests is going to deplete us to have any ability to do any of the diagnostic testing. So does anybody have any thoughts, guidance, or at least we can take that back to the appropriate people so we can get guidance out to the nurses of how the test to stay program will go in the future?
We have been strongly advocating to not, as we sort of said, to not be quarantining close contacts who we agree with the CDC upgrade, change that says 5 to 17-year-olds, they get their 2 shots, even if they don't have a booster, they're not quarantined, because you cannot test to stay. There's lots of reasons for that. And one of them is that it's so much work to test to stay, and then you're just quarantining everyone. So we have strongly advocated for that change now, and we're waiting. So, and one of the arguments is this. So I really feel you there. I would also say I am curious if anyone here is in a school that has adopted the 80%, the stuff that is on the books right now. If your school has reached 80%, you don't contact trace anymore. And I'm just curious to hear if anyone on the call has made that shift and how that's going.
Go ahead, Carol.
Hi, I'm Carol Hockey from Rice High School. We made that shift, and I'm and my coworker Janie Ann are struggling because suddenly we don't have any language to tell the parents like what we're doing, because now we feel like we're not at 80% because we only have about 30% of the eligible juniors and seniors having received their boosters. And I'm almost feeling paralyzed this week. We have more cases than we've ever had. We don't have our antigen test from the state yet because we've recently completed the process. And it's really, really hard. I feel like we're doing everybody a disservice because we don't have test to stay. We don't really have authority to tell these kids that they need to go home and quarantine. And our principals made it clear we're almost at the breaking point of having to shut our school anyway because of the high absentee rate. So the sooner we would have something to be able to tell parents like that either this 80% highly vaccinated isn't a thing anymore, because now we're including boosters in that metric. And it's very hard to quickly gather the information of who's boosted suddenly coming back on Monday after this. So that's where we're at. I'm still not sure what we're going to do tomorrow.
Thank you, Carol. That's great. Before I call on you, I think Ilisa was going to make a comment, and I would like to give her a chance to make that comment, and then we'll go to Katie for her update.
Thanks, Clayton. I did put it in the chat. I think as Becca described, a lot of sort of the decisions about the 80% and and test to stay are all really hinged on this question that is before our leadership about the booster for the pediatric population and whether or not that's is part of the isolation and quarantine guidance for that population. And so once we have, Kaitlyn has worked furiously this week to put this FAQ together, but we can't release it because it could go one of two ways. We are hopeful it goes the way that Becca described, but so that's sort of a keystone moment that everything else, all the other guidance can flow from once we have that, and that will answer some of your questions. It may mean that there are more cases in school, and we're not necessarily test to staying them or contact tracing them, because if the decision is that boosters are not part of the equation for kids and around quarantine and vaccine, then those kids would not participate in, so unboosted kids would not participate in FAQs. And so it's less testing, but potentially more virus. So it's a balance there. But we are really hopeful that we had hoped that we would have the answer on Tuesday. It's now almost Friday. There's a good chance we might have an answer tomorrow and get some information out to you either tomorrow or Monday. But it's not my decision to make. So we'll keep you posted.
Okay, thanks, Ilisa. And if they can just not make an announcement at 4:30 tomorrow afternoon that changes everything again, we would all really have some joy with that. So I just want to make that statement and put it out there. And this is being recorded, so I know that I might be heard. But I just
promised Clayton to bring that forward. Soph will put bets down on when that will come out, but we will certainly convey that thinking.
Thank you. Katie, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, so the Woodstock High School, we had been at 80%. We reached 80% in October. We were all really excited to go back and review to see how many more of our students had been vaccinated. And so when this new guidance came out, it actually wasn't the parents that were the most surprised. It was our seniors and our juniors. And those are the students who have shouldered this pandemic since they were in 9th grade. And they felt like, I've done everything. Like, you said, get vaccinated, I got vaccinated. You said, wear a mask, I've worn a mask. Like, those were, you want to talk about being emotional? Those were the hardest conversations to have. And so I just feel like they have to be grandfathered in because they've lost so much. And so I don't know, none of us really have the control. None of us are the decision makers, but it's super exciting on the one hand because our elementary school students are in that place where they are fully vaccinated. But it's really tough to explain to that population of kid who absolutely gets it. And they're just looking at you like, how can this be? And you're like, I know it sucks. And like, this can be your safe space to, come and bash COVID or whatever. But I don't know. Those are my thoughts.
So Katie, thank you. And the term I heard when that came out was the rug pulled out from under them because of their commitment. And I was amazed when we were running ours. The 18 plus was so much slower. The 16 and 17-year-olds were on it. I mean, I was amazed how quickly they got their booster shots. And then when they were able to, but now the younger ones that haven't had the opportunity yet, it's definitely made it hard. So appreciate that. And everyone I think is right on that edge of, I'm almost crying every day. I'm luckily have the pre-K right across from my office, so I get to laugh at all that stuff. But but thank you. And that was a very honest response. Before I make a couple of closing remarks, and I think Kelly might say something also, Doctors Lee, Razska, Bell, or Holmes, is there anything, or Ilisa or Kaitlyn, is there anything else, closing remarks that you guys would like to make?
I would just like to say thank you. You have just done amazing work. The pressures are just intense. We feel that. If there's anything we can do to support you, we'd love to continue to do that. And just our deep appreciation for what you're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Razska.
Yeah, I'll echo the same. Just thank you again for everything. And I know, so I know we weren't able to get all the questions in the chat as they were coming through. And, based on some of the stuff that we've discussed, I mean, it's clear that we're still in a stage where lots of things, as Dr. Razska mentioned earlier, it's a fluid situation. So even after this meeting, I'm sure there's still going to be revisions and changes coming, and so just hang in there with us. We'll try to make sure that we can get things to the best of our ability. Like I said, we don't work for I don't work for the state or anything, but just trying to get clarity on and and have a final plan as soon as we can, because I know it's the uncertainty and not knowing right now that's that's certainly not helping matters. But I expect that things will continue to evolve, and like I said, we'll do the best we can at trying to communicate and get the most up-to-date information out there, and to do things and to and to work together with you all. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge somebody way further back said that they came today hoping for more answers. And I just want to acknowledge that we were hoping for that as well. And when we set this up earlier in the week, we thought we would have the FAQ. We thought we'd have the what to do with 5 to 17-year-old who aren't boosted answer. So that's been a really hard part of the pandemic in general. We've talked to each other a lot about that sort of health, the way we're trained as healthcare professionals, and people come to us expecting like which antibiotic to use for which, and so that space you're in where people come to you for answers and you came tonight for answers and you're not getting them, it doesn't feel very good. And maybe because we're wrapping up, Dory asked that really great question at the beginning about like what are the sort of, maybe from Becca and Ben and Bill's perspective, like what should they be focused on, these nurses who have, unlimited capacity for just adding on, but where do we, like in the old days, we used to say mask is probably a little bit more important than wiping down every surface, that kind of thing. So if we could end with that, to just leave with some of the sort of hopeful, because the schools are very safe. You guys have done a beautiful job. I know it doesn't feel that way, but that is what the data tells us. And it's safer for kids to be in school than to be, out in the community as it relates to infection. So I'll stop there with a lot of gratitude.
Thank you. Dr. Bell?
Gratitude from me as well. I do want to point out there's a few, I'm trying to tie up some practical stuff, but there are a bunch of people, and this, you may not have tests to stay, but for staff who would otherwise need to quarantine, people are worried about staff getting exposed and then having to quarantine and school shutting down, but they can participate in test to stay if that's something that's available, if you have that. And then just for Carol, the fully vaccinated, again, if you think about Dr. Razska's slide, it is that that primary series, and Kaitlyn put in the chat that 80% rule. It is it doesn't include boosters. So I think that was one of the questions, was like, oh, are we not at 80% anymore because we don't have enough people boosted. So I think just we're trying to keep, stick with the language, like fully vaccinated is the primary series. And then, the CDC might use words like up to date, or Dr. Levine might say like fully protected is, including sort of what you're eligible for and have you gotten those things. So to clarify those pieces, I think one of the hard things about is just, I sometimes feel this as my role as an intensivist. I have a lot of consultants that I work with, and then families, and that nothing is worse than going and telling a family, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do. And then 2 seconds later, it's a different plan, or someone else has a different plan, and you have to go back. And then there's just like a lot of loss of confidence in you, and it really hurts that relationship. And that's the thing that I always worry for you all, is that you are the ones who have these relationships with your families and with your educators. And people look to you to guide them. And then you are just, the communication has not been good. And I'm sorry, because I know that like, it's one thing to say like, we'll get this out as soon as possible. And you're like, okay, well, I have to make some phone calls right now, and I have to like see people tomorrow. So I don't know what to say, except for that we are here to support you, and we're here to kind of push to try to get you guidance, because we need consistency, and you all need to kind of go back to not being COVID police. That's our goal. But thank you all so much for everything that you do.
Thanks very much. Kaitlyn or Ilisa?
I am currently trying to gather any of the questions I don't know answers to and forward them to the right people. So just to let you all know, that's why I'm furiously typing and clanking around over here. So once again, thank you all so much. I know it's a really frustrating time. We hear you. So thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to echo everybody's sentiments of thanks and gratitude, and the challenges, sort of acknowledge them of this week in particular, not to mention the last many months. It's been a pretty challenging for many of us, and we had some inside information about the process, so I can't imagine how it feels to be sort of not aware of what's going on or wondering what in the world the health department or AOE is doing, taking so long to get some of this out. So really appreciate you all, and we will continue to work hard to get that clarity that you're all seeking, and please just continue to reach out to any of us really at any time if you have questions or need clarity, and we will get these questions answered for you. So thank you all.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. So Kelly might have some specific things she wants to speak about. I want to mention just a couple of things really quickly. The COVID-19 at vssna.org email is open all the time. So if you have questions and you send it to that, it automatically emails the whole executive board for VSSNA, and then we get those questions out to the appropriate parties so they can respond to them, or we can sometimes answer them directly. So that's always available. Secondly, if anybody isn't a VSSNA member, please consider joining. We have dropped down to 168 members from the high of 210. I'm not quite sure. We had this huge influx of folks when COVID first started. And I'm just wondering if COVID has burned everybody out to not even want to know if they're joining an organization. But those membership dues pays for the things that we do here. And we have no money coming in. We haven't been able to have conferences. So it would be great if people had considered that. You belong to NASN and VSSNA at the same time. But we went from 203 to 168 over the course of the last 6 months. And it saddens me somewhat because we have huge audiences on these, and it would be great to get something in back from that. So I'm going to leave that and mute myself now. And Kelly, you can close this out.
Thanks, Clayton. I appreciate your humor. I just, on behalf of VSSNA and all school nurses, I wanted to give a very, very hearty thanks to all of our professionals here on our panel today that are helping us, Dr. Bell, Dr. Holmes, Dr. Lee, Dr. Razska, and Kaitlyn and Ilisa from VDH. We're so very thankful for you. You've been here with us every step of the way, and we truly couldn't have done this without you. Just being able to send emails and get answers, and you've given so much of your time on town halls and just in many other ways. So thank you so very much. We're very, very thankful. And thanks to all of the nurses who are here today, and we'll continue to be here for all of you. So we'll get through this all together. Thanks and have a great night.